The prisoner was suddenly horrified to discover that his cellmate seemed to have turned into a cold corpse. However, just as he was about to call for the guards, he was immediately stopped by his fellow inmates. To fill his stomach, Louis also chose to remain silent and could only move away from the body to find another spot to continue eating. But at that moment, a prisoner suddenly approached, looking for trouble. Seeing this, Henri hurried over to intervene, but instead of leaving, the other prisoners started provoking them. Just as the two were about to come to blows, a loud gunshot instantly snapped them back to reality. It turned out that break time was over, and all the prisoners lined up to prepare for their return. However, the group hadn't walked far before they encountered a stranded Barrat. The captain wasn't about to pass up such an opportunity and quickly decided to help him. To Henri's surprise, Barrat happened to sit right next to them in the vehicle. Realizing this was his chance, Henri began striking up a conversation with him. What surprised him even more was when Barrat clearly stated that his ship would be docked at the island for 3 days. Henri intended to bribe him for a way out, but Barrat not only refused outright but also threatened to report him to the guards. Terrified, Henri quickly upped the price, narrowly escaping the threat. However, Barrat then made a steep demand. After some bargaining, the two sides finally reached a cooperation, but Barrat emphasized that he would only stay for 3 days, and when the time was up, he would leave immediately. Little did Henri know, this decision would soon lead to a major crisis. After returning to the prison, the two were assigned to dispose of their cellmate's body, but halfway through, Louis suddenly noticed with horror that crimson blood was seeping out of the sack. He, first time in prison, had never witnessed such a gruesome scene. Despite Henri's constant reassurances, Louis was so terrified that his limbs froze, and he collapsed onto the ground, unable to take another step. The guard behind them immediately became furious, but no matter how much he yelled, Louis just sat there with vacant eyes, completely unresponsive. The guard behind them immediately became furious, feeling his authority had been challenged. Without a word, he pulled a whip from his belt and began lashing out wildly at Louis. Watching his companion's face twist in pain, Henri gritted his teeth and made a reckless decision. He picked up a stone from the ground and smashed it hard against the guard's head. It wasn't until Henri snapped out of his rage that he realized the gravity of what he'd just done. Without wasting another second, he turned and bolted into the depths of the jungle. It wasn't long before more guards arrived and began chasing Henri in the direction he had fled, leaving behind a terrified Louis. Louis, helpless and panicked, shouted his companion's name, but the only reply he got was the sound of gunfire echoing endlessly. Meanwhile, Henri didn't dare slow down for even a moment, sprinting desperately forward. Before long, he reached the edge of a stream and jumped in without hesitation. The guards soon caught up and fired furiously at Henri as he swam. Luckily, the bullets narrowly missed him every time, and he managed to escape downstream. Slipping out of sight, he kept running until nightfall and finally managed to find Barrat. Suppressing his excitement, Henri quickly approached him, urging him to set sail. However, Barrat remained unmoved, insisting he needed the money up front before leaving. Henri was dumbfounded. Having never expected his escape would unfold this way, he hadn't brought any money with him. Seeing himself so close to freedom, Henri refused to give up. He pitifully explained that he had a large sum of money waiting for him in Paris, promising Barrat that he would be handsomely rewarded if he helped him escape. To Henri's surprise, Barrat nodded and agreed without hesitation. Just as Henri was about to board the ship, he suddenly heard the sound of a gun being cocked. A group of armed men were pointing their weapons directly at him, leaving him frozen in place. The next morning, Henri was brought back by 2 guards, his limbs shackled with heavy chains that severely restricted his movement. Even in this state, the warden had no intention of letting him off lightly. According to the prison rules, a first escape attempt would result in 2.5 years of solitary confinement. For a second attempt, the punishment was 5 years. Even if someone managed to survive, they would be sent to Devil's Island, a place from which most never returned alive. In the tiny, stifling solitary cell, prisoners endured not only unbearable loneliness but also received just 1 meal a day. Even worse, the food was spoiled slop. To survive, Henri had no choice but to suppress his gag reflex and force the foul broth down his throat. Despite the terrible conditions, Henri somehow endured for half a month. But one day, the cell door suddenly swung open, and the captain he had assaulted before swaggered in. Henri knew the captain was there for revenge, but instead of cowering in fear, Henri boldly provoked him in return. Predictably, this enraged the captain, and Henri became a living punching bag, forced to stand there and take the beating. After the attack, Henri, already weakened, was now in even worse shape, his body pushed to the brink. He thought he was going to slowly starve to death in that cell, but to his surprise, one day when the food bucket was delivered, there was half a coconut inside. Puzzled, Henri lifted the lid and discovered a small piece of paper tucked inside. On the paper were just 3 short lines, yet those words felt like a wave of warmth and hope, deeply touching Henri's heart. Tears of gratitude welled up in his eyes. He knew that it must have been Louis, worried that he would starve to death, who had paid off the guard to sneak in some real food, with the fresh coconut meat to nourish him. Henri's hope for survival was reignited. From that moment on, Henri made a firm decision. Not only was he determined to survive and leave the solitary cell, but he also vowed to escape with Louis by his side. In the following days, Henri's strength slowly returned. Through daily exercise, his physical condition greatly improved. Everything seemed to be heading in the right direction, until one day, disaster struck. During mealtime, as Henri was about to reach for his food, the guard outside suddenly stopped him and took the meal away for inspection. Soon after, the sound of agonizing screams echoed from outside. Before Henri could fully grasp what was happening, the screams abruptly stopped. The next moment, a stream of bright red blood seeped through the crack under the door. It was clear the person delivering the food had met a gruesome fate. But now, Henri had to worry about his own safety. Filled with dread, he curled up in a corner, waiting anxiously until dusk. As the cell door slowly creaked open, the warden entered the room. Henri stared him down in silence, refusing to say a word. The warden, equally silent, grew impatient. Without saying anything, he turned and left. But he didn't leave without a parting blow. He cut Henri's rations in half. For the next month, the long-term starvation drained most of Henri's vitality, leaving him looking like a frail, dying old man. Just when he was on the verge of giving up, the warden returned to the solitary cell, holding a steaming bowl of meat soup. He offered Henri a deal: reveal the names of his accomplices, and he could enjoy the delicious soup. To the warden's surprise, despite being reduced to such a pitiful state, Henri not only refused to give up his comrades but also mustered the last of his strength to hurl insults at the warden. Shaking with rage, the warden ordered the skylight to be sealed, plunging Henri into total darkness. Loneliness, darkness, and hunger weighed down on him like a crushing mountain, suffocating Henri almost to the point of breaking. At his lowest, he even contemplated ending his own life to escape the torment. Yet, against all odds, Henri managed to survive the hellish conditions for 2.5 years. When he was finally released, he was barely clinging to life, so weak that he needed 2 guards to help him walk. Meanwhile, Louis had risen to prominence within the prison, using his refined and gentlemanly appearance to secure a position as the warden's secretary. Upon hearing that Henri's confinement had ended, Louis rushed to the infirmary to visit him, but to his shock, the Henri lying on the bed was a hollow shell, his eyes vacant and unresponsive. No matter how many questions Louis asked, Henri remained completely silent, as if his spirit had been broken beyond repair. Just as Louis was about to turn and leave, Henri suddenly snapped back to normal. It turned out that the 2.5 years of torment hadn't crushed Henri's desire to escape. In fact, it had only intensified his longing for freedom. Louis immediately revealed that in 3 days, the warden would be hosting a banquet to entertain visiting politicians, and it would be the perfect opportunity for their escape. Henri thought it over briefly and quickly agreed. That same night, Henri pretended to sleep, waiting for the overseer to leave. Once alone, he opened his eyes and sneaked over to find the frail Macherette, hoping to enlist his help. It turned out that the overseer had long been lusting after Macherette, but had never succeeded in his advances. Henri proposed a deal: if Macherette could distract the overseer in 3 days' time, he would take him along on the escape. Macherette, desperate to leave, agreed without hesitation. The next day, Louis brought in Charrière, who claimed he could secure a boat for their escape. With that, the 4-man escape team was complete. Soon, the night of the banquet arrived. All the politicians gathered in the hall. Enjoying a movie screening, Louis quietly slipped backstage, using his position to obtain a bottle of fine red wine. Once he ensured no one was around, he discreetly mixed in a packet of sleeping powder. Then, he headed to the infirmary, telling the guards there that the warden had sent the wine as a gift. Naturally, the guards didn't want to miss out on such a treat, and Louis poured them each a full glass. Meanwhile, Macherette, who was usually resistant to the overseer's advances, uncharacteristically agreed to his advances that night. As the two went to the bathroom, Henri and Charrière removed the legs from a bed and quietly followed them to the restroom, where they managed to knock the overseer unconscious from behind. But they didn't rush to act. Instead, they waited in the bathroom for 2.5 minutes, calculating that by then, the drug would have taken effect on the infirmary guards. Once the time was right, the three quietly crept downstairs and effortlessly incapacitated the remaining guards below. Despite their success, they were still a bit early. The banquet outside had not yet ended, so the three had no choice but to wait in the infirmary. Then, out of nowhere, it began to rain heavily. The banquet was forced to end early, and as if by a stroke of luck, the entire prison lost power just as the storm intensified. Henri and his team anxiously waited in the darkened infirmary, knowing their moment was fast approaching. Just as Louis arrived with the keys, the group wasted no time. Under the cover of night and the sound of rain, they stealthily climbed up the prison wall, one by one, and jumped down to the other side. However, just as Louis was about to jump, the power suddenly came back on. Startled, he jumped in a panic but landed awkwardly, breaking his leg in the process. With Louis now a burden, their escape speed slowed significantly. Fortunately, they managed to reach the small boat and successfully set off into the open sea. But to their horror, the boat began leaking halfway through their journey. They had to constantly bail water to keep from sinking. To make matters worse, a massive storm rolled in, pushing the already fragile boat to its limits. Charrière, desperate to survive, suggested abandoning Louis, the dead weight. Henri, however, adamantly refused. The argument quickly escalated into a fight, but Charrière was far too strong for the weaker Henri to handle. In the nick of time, Louis intervened, catching Charrière off guard. In the struggle, Charrière met his end. They threw his body into the sea, but even that didn't ease their troubles. The storm was relentless, and their small, battered boat was on the verge of falling apart. The trio, now just Henri, Louis, and Charrière, were exhausted beyond belief. After an unknown amount of time passed, Henri woke up from unconsciousness, overjoyed to find that they had reached land. It looked like an ancient village, but to his surprise, the leader of the tribe was a nun. In their conversation, Henri learned that both Louis and Charrière had survived, and he finally felt relief. The overwhelming joy of survival washed over him. He couldn't believe they had made it, yet the blood and grime on his body constantly reminded him of the ordeal they had endured. After cleaning himself up, Henri intended to scout the island, hoping to find a way to return home. However, as he reached a road, he caught sight of a car driving toward the shore. To his horror, two prison guards stepped out, seemingly on their way to the beach. Terrified, Henri ran back to the village as fast as he could, but it was too late. Charrière was shot dead on the spot, and both Henri and Louis were captured by the guards. It turned out that the nun had betrayed them and tipped off the authorities. There was no more room for resistance. Henri and Louis surrendered, because it was Henri's second escape attempt. He was sentenced to a full 5 years in solitary confinement. When his time was up, the warden personally came to greet him, but Henri paid no attention and calmly followed the guards to Devil's Island. To his surprise, he saw Louis again. It turned out that Louis, once the warden's trusted secretary, had betrayed that path. Furious, the warden sent him to Devil's Island as punishment. Although there were no guards on Devil's Island, it was far more terrifying than solitary confinement. Prisoners frequently took their own lives. Unable to bear the relentless isolation, Louis had grown accustomed to the place. But Henri was deeply shaken. He refused to spend the rest of his life trapped there. Every day, he stared at the sea, searching for a way to escape, but the island was surrounded by water on all sides, and the cliffs were hundreds of meters high. Jumping directly into the ocean meant almost certain death. Still, Henri was determined to try. He convinced Louis to help him, and together they filled sacks with empty coconuts to create a makeshift raft. Dragging the sacks to the shore, they were almost ready to make their escape when Louis chose to stay behind. He had grown too accustomed to life on the island and believed he now belonged there. Henri was shocked but respected his decision. The two embraced tightly, knowing this would be their final farewell. They understood they would never see each other again. Henri tossed the sack into the sea and jumped after it without hesitation. Even though the attempt might cost him his life, he had no regrets. In the end, Henri was lucky enough to survive. Protected by the coconut raft, he floated aimlessly on the endless waves. This story is based on real events. The real Henri Charrière escaped from Devil's Island and lived in hiding until 1969, when he returned to France and wrote his autobiography, Papillon. In 1970, the French Minister of Justice annulled his charges, and shortly thereafter, the penal colony in French Guiana was permanently closed. I'm a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.